Did you hear that? The pilot laughed, leaning back in his seat like the cockpit was a comedy club instead of a machine flying through the sky at 30,000 feet. Nightingale, that's her call sign. The other pilot snorted, covering his mouth for a second before pointing forward. A nurse, sitting in a cockpit. Yeah, that makes sense. The woman in the center seat didn't turn around. Her hands rested lightly near the controls she wasn't even supposed to touch. Her headset pressed against her ears, the quiet hum of the aircraft vibrating through the metal frame around them. Outside the wide cockpit window, the sky stretched endless and blue, clouds rolling beneath the wing like soft white waves. But the calm inside the aircraft wasn't real, not for her. She could feel it in the air, in the tone of their voices, in the way they treated her presence like a joke they hadn't finished telling yet. Relax, Nightingale, the first pilot said with a grin, leaning forward slightly. You patch people up, right? You don't fly airplanes. The second pilot laughed harder this time, nudging his partner. Hey, maybe if someone gets a paper cut back here, she can help. The woman finally blinked slowly, her eyes steady. She didn't answer them, not because she didn't have something to say, but because she had learned something a long time ago. Sometimes the loudest people in a room were the ones who understood the least about what was actually happening. The aircraft shuddered very slightly, almost too subtle for passengers to notice. But she noticed. Her eyes shifted toward the engine display for a fraction of a second. A quiet warning flickered across the panel before disappearing again. Behind her, the pilots were still laughing. Before this story goes any further, the narrator's voice might say softly to the viewer watching at home, take a second to subscribe because stories like this deserve to be heard. Because in that cockpit, in that moment, something far bigger than pride or ego was beginning to unfold. Something that would force everyone on that aircraft to rethink what strength really looked like. And none of them, not the pilots, not the passengers, not even the quiet woman they called Nightingale yet, understood how close they were to the moment that would change everything. The flight had started like 100 others that morning. Calm skies, predictable route, routine procedures. The aircraft was halfway across the country, carrying nearly 200 passengers who believed they were simply traveling from one place to another. Business meetings, family visits, vacations, ordinary lives moving through the air at 500 miles an hour. But inside the cockpit, the atmosphere had shifted the moment she stepped through the door. Her name was Alina Reyes, 29 years old, registered trauma nurse. On most days she worked in an emergency department where seconds mattered and calm thinking saved lives. But on this flight she wasn't working. She had simply been a passenger until a medical situation earlier in the cabin changed everything. A passenger had fainted shortly after takeoff. Alina had stepped in automatically, the way medical professionals do when instinct overrides everything else. Calm voice, steady hands, quick assessment. Within minutes, the situation was stable. The crew had been grateful, the passengers relieved, and the captain had invited her forward to thank her personally. That's how she ended up sitting in the jump seat in the cockpit, still wearing her blue scrubs from the overnight hospital shift she had just finished. What the pilots didn't know, what they didn't bother asking, was that Alina had grown up around aircraft. Her father had been a mechanic for small charter planes in Arizona. As a teenager, she had spent weekends sitting in hangars listening to pilots talk about wind patterns, engine performance, and emergency procedures. She never became a pilot. Life had taken her toward medicine instead. But airplanes had never been unfamiliar to her. Still, the two men behind the controls didn't see any of that. All they saw was a nurse sitting somewhere they believed she didn't belong. Captain Mark Dalton was the kind of pilot who filled a room with his voice. Mid-40s, confident, decorated career, the sort of man who believed experience made him untouchable. Beside him sat First Officer Brian Keller, younger but eager to mirror the captain's attitude, laughing at the same jokes before they were even finished. Their amusement wasn't loud enough for passengers to hear, but inside the cockpit it echoed clearly. So Nightingale, Keller said with a smirk, adjusting his cap. Ever flown one of these before? Alina kept her gaze forward. Calm. No, she said simply. Dalton chuckled. Didn't think so. But Alina's eyes drifted across the instrument panel again. She noticed things most passengers would never see. Subtle fluctuations, small system alerts, clearing themselves before they became serious warnings. Nothing catastrophic. Not yet. Still, the feeling in her chest tightened slightly. It was the same instinct she relied on in the hospital, when a patient looked stable on paper but something in the room didn't feel right. Dalton leaned back again. You know, people love hero stories, he said casually. Nurse saves the day. Makes good headlines. Keller laughed again. Yeah, maybe you'll get one. Alina didn't answer. Instead, she looked quietly out the left window. For a moment the sky seemed perfectly peaceful, but far below the wing, a thin dark trail drifted briefly behind the engine before disappearing into the clouds. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. Behind her, the pilots were still smiling, but Alina had already learned something they hadn't noticed yet. Sometimes danger doesn't announce itself loudly. Sometimes it starts as a whisper, and if you're not listening carefully, you miss it. 10 minutes later, the cockpit laughter faded, not because the pilots suddenly gained respect, but because routine demanded their attention again. Radio calls, navigation updates, small adjustments to maintain altitude, Alina remained quiet in the jump seat, hands folded loosely, eyes occasionally scanning the instruments without making it obvious. Years in emergency medicine had taught her something important. Observation saves lives long before action ever does. Captain Dalton adjusted the autopilot setting while Keller read off a weather update ahead. Turbulence, expected but mild. Nothing unusual. Just another cross-country flight moving through predictable skies. But then the aircraft trembled again. Slightly stronger this time. Dalton frowned for half a second. Probably just air pocket, he muttered. Keller nodded quickly, eager to agree. But Elena's eyes moved instantly toward the engine data display. One number dipped for a fraction of a second, then stabilized again. She said nothing. Not yet. In a hospital, you don't interrupt a senior surgeon based on a single data point. You wait, you watch, you confirm. Dalton leaned back again, glancing toward her with a faint grin returning to his face. You're awfully quiet back there, Nightingale. Elena finally spoke, her tone calm and professional. Just observing. Keller smirked. Observing what? We're not exactly doing open-heart surgery up here. Dalton chuckled again, but Elena didn't react. Instead, she focused again on the instruments. Another fluctuation. This time a small warning flickered and vanished so quickly it might have been easy to miss. Keller rubbed his chin. You see that? Dalton shrugged. Sensor glitch probably. Elena's heartbeat slowed, not faster. It was the strange paradox of crisis response. The closer danger came, the calmer she became. The same thing happened when trauma patients arrived, bleeding into an emergency room. Everyone else panicked. She focused. Outside the cockpit window, sunlight reflected off the wing. For a moment, everything looked normal again. Then the aircraft vibrated harder. Dalton straightened immediately. His hand moved instinctively toward the throttle. Okay, that's not turbulence. Keller leaned forward, scanning the panel now. A faint alarm tone chimed once. Elena watched their faces carefully. The confidence was still there, but now it had a crack in it. Dalton pressed a button, running a quick diagnostic. Engine pressure drop, Keller said slowly, reading the screen. But it's correcting. Elena spoke again quietly. How long has it been fluctuating? Both pilots turned toward her slightly. Dalton raised an eyebrow. Why? Elena answered calmly. Because intermittent problems sometimes mean something is about to fail completely. Keller laughed lightly again, though it sounded thinner now. Relax, Nightingale. These engines are designed with redundancy. Elena nodded once. So are hospitals. The cockpit went quiet for a second. Dalton turned back to the panel. Another vibration ran through the aircraft, stronger this time. And this time the alarm didn't stop immediately. Keller's smile vanished. The warning light blinked again. Once, twice. Elena's eyes stayed on the panel, because she had seen this pattern before, not in airplanes, but in failing human bodies. Systems compensating, right up until the moment they couldn't anymore. Dalton muttered under his breath now, fingers moving faster across the controls. That's not supposed to happen. And for the first time since Elena entered the cockpit, neither pilot was laughing anymore. The sky outside still looked peaceful, but something inside the aircraft had begun to change. Everyone in that cockpit could feel it. The alarm didn't scream at first, it pulsed, a steady electronic tone that seemed almost polite, as if the aircraft itself was trying to warn them without causing panic. Captain Dalton leaned forward sharply, his earlier confidence tightening into focus as his eyes locked onto the instrument panel. Engine 1, pressure dropping, Keller said under his breath, the humor gone from his voice now. Outside the cockpit window, the sunlight still painted the clouds in calm shades of white and blue, but the vibration traveling through the aircraft told a different story entirely. Elena Reyes remained still in the jump seat, her calm expression unchanged, but inside her mind the pattern was becoming clearer with every passing second. In the emergency room she had learned that failure rarely happened suddenly. It arrived in stages, warning signs first, small fluctuations, systems trying desperately to compensate before the collapse came. The aircraft trembled again, this time harder. Dalton's hand moved quickly across the controls, running engine diagnostics. Keller swallowed. Temperature spike. Fuel flow, unstable. Elena listened carefully, not interrupting. But the quiet nurse in blue scrubs was now analyzing every word they said the way she would study a patient's vitals. The cockpit lights flickered briefly, then stabilized again. A moment later another tone echoed through the small space. Keller looked up from the panel, eyes widening. Captain, we just lost partial thrust. Dalton's jaw tightened. The aircraft dipped ever so slightly before the autopilot compensated. Elena noticed the change instantly, the subtle shift in gravity, the pressure difference in the airframe. Passengers behind them probably assumed it was turbulence. But up here in the cockpit the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Dalton's voice dropped into a command tone now, shutting down engine 1 before it tears itself apart. His fingers moved quickly across the switches. The engine whine outside softened slightly as systems adjusted. Keller exhaled slowly. Okay, we're still flying. One engine is enough. Elena nodded faintly, but her eyes moved again toward the panel. The numbers weren't settling the way they should. Dalton noticed it at the same moment. His expression hardened. Why is Engine 2 compensating that aggressively? Keller leaned closer to the display, reading quickly. Because it's carrying the entire load. The aircraft shuddered again, this time with a deeper vibration that rolled through the fuselage like distant thunder. Alina felt it in her spine, and in that instant a memory surfaced from years earlier sitting in a dusty hangar beside her father while a pilot explained something about engine strain during imbalanced conditions. Too much stress on the remaining engine, and it overheats faster than expected. Her voice came out calm but firm. You need to reduce strain before the second engine overheats. Both pilots glanced toward her again. A few minutes earlier they might have laughed at that suggestion, but now the cockpit atmosphere had changed. Dalton's eyes studied her carefully for a moment. You said you're a nurse. Alina nodded once. Trauma nurse. But I grew up around aircraft maintenance. Keller blinked. You're serious. Alina kept her voice steady. When systems fail under pressure, they don't care about titles. They care about load. Dalton hesitated for half a second, the calculation clear on his face. Pride versus logic. But before he could respond, the alarm tone changed, pitch sharper now, louder. Keller looked back at the display and his voice tightened. Captain, Engine 2, temperature rising fast. Dalton cursed under his breath and immediately adjusted the throttle. The aircraft nose shifted slightly upward as he compensated, but Alina could already see the truth written across the panel numbers. The remaining engine was working too hard. Dalton leaned toward the radio, calling air traffic control, his voice professional but strained. Control. This is Flight 247 requesting immediate vector to nearest airport due to engine failure. Static crackled briefly before the controller responded. Keller scanned the map display. Nearest runway, 40 minutes out. 40 minutes. Alina's mind calculated automatically. The engine temperature gauge climbed another small increment. Dalton saw it too. That engine won't last 40 minutes, Alina said quietly. Neither pilot argued, because deep down they already knew. The aircraft trembled again, a long shiver passing through the metal frame. Dalton wiped his forehead quickly, though the cockpit temperature hadn't changed. Keller stared at the display like he was willing the numbers to reverse themselves. Alina leaned slightly forward in the jump seat now, her voice calm in a way that seemed almost impossible given the situation. In the hospital, she said softly, when someone is crashing, panic wastes oxygen, calm thinking saves it. Keller looked back at her. For the first time since she entered the cockpit, there was no trace of mockery in his expression, only concern. Dalton inhaled slowly, forcing his breathing steady. The aircraft vibrated again as Engine 2 struggled under the load. Outside the window, the sky remained beautifully indifferent. Alina studied the panel again, then spoke carefully. You still have control. The system hasn't failed yet, but it's telling you something important. Dalton glanced at her. What Alina met his eyes calmly. It's telling you this moment matters. The cockpit fell quiet except for the alarms and the distant roar of the struggling engine. Every person on that aircraft, nearly 200 lives, depended on decisions made in this tiny room over the next few minutes. Keller looked between Dalton and Alina, the earlier arrogance gone completely now. Dalton tightened his grip on the controls, determination replacing doubt. Okay, he said quietly, let's keep everyone alive. Alina sat back slightly again, steady as ever, and somewhere beyond the cockpit door, passengers continued reading books, watching movies, or sleeping unaware that their lives were hanging on the courage and clarity of three people sitting at the front of the aircraft. In life, moments like this appear without warning. The difference between fear and strength isn't who makes the loudest noise, it's who stays calm when everything around them starts to shake. And sometimes the quietest person in the room becomes the reason everyone makes it home safely.